the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemist, to the whole state of things, a pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to the Machine Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, we are sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we jump into today's discussion, consider tossing us $1 a month at patreon.com/MUHH, or please leave us a review on iTunes. Also, friendly shout out to Jeannie Jen for the Fear is the Mind Killer review on iTunes. We always appreciate reviews that are interesting and that coincide with our interests. Obviously, this one being a Dune reference for Cooper over here. Leave us a review maybe for next week. Whoever leaves a review saying "explain Deleuze to me right now" can get a shout out. But today, Cooper and I are discussing Marx's dissertation on the Democritean and Epicurean differences in the philosophy of nature. And Coop, you have pointed out, and we kind of discussed this a little bit with Ray Brazier when we had him on last month about the dissertation. I believe it's in the foreword where he kind of makes this intimation about Prometheus being like the martyr of philosophy. I think he says it's something like this, right? Yeah, Marx quotes
the Confession of Prometheus.
Yeah, Marx quotes Aeschylus, Prometheus bound, I believe is how it's generally translated. And he has several quotes, in simple words, I hate the pack of gods. And he finds in the quote, its own confession, its own aphorism against all heavenly and earthly gods who do not acknowledge human self-consciousness as the highest divinity. And then there's one more quote of Aeschylus, I believe, Prometheus saying to Hermes, right, the messenger of the gods, the little lackey of the gods, "Be sure of this, I would not change my state of evil fortune for your servitude. Better to be the servant of this rock than to be faithful boy to Father Zeus." And he ends by saying Prometheus is the most eminent saint and martyr in the philosophical calendar, which again, as we said, Ray Brazier kind of mentions Prometheus and obviously has his own kind of brand of philosophical inquiry that is roughly kind of termed under Prometheanism. And Nihil Unbound, I assume, is like a wink and a nod to this notion of Prometheus bound by Aeschylus. And what is Prometheus Unbound? Shelley?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Just this is like a Jeopardy question, romantic poets for 400, Alex. But also the other Shelley subtitled Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus, right? So that's also kind of an interesting coincidence. You have something here about the Prometheus quote perhaps being a rallying cry for materialism. What were you thinking of when you wrote that down? Or was that just kind of an intuition that came to you?
Yeah, I guess it was a sort of intuition, perhaps just kind of reading in between the lines of this Promethean sort of proclamation. And I guess, it would probably go towards something like the myth of the given or something like that, right? Like the world is made in a sense.
Yeah, right.
And so that distinction probably is, I think, what I was trying to do. But maybe I was even trying to say that the dissertation itself is this sort of rallying cry for materialism.
Yeah, I like that. If we are kind of forced, sort of before going into a broad discussion of Marx's interest in this, what he calls, like, if we take a microscope, we can kind of see that there are these divergences that Epicurus doesn't just inherit from Democritus and Leucippus, the atomistic theory wholesale, but there are literally these little clinamens, these little swerves that Epicurus, he himself is the one that comes up with the clinamen and the swerve. That's not really found in Democritus and Lucretius. But if there is an interest in the differences between these two systems in the evolution of the atomistic theory, I think it makes sense to see in it this interest in materialism. If you consider the other pre-Socratics, they are known as the physiologists, which means they try to find a primordial principle, primordial element of physis, of nature, that can sort of rationally explain all of its configurations and transformations, whereas
like a transcendental signifier type.
Something like that,
vibe,
yeah.
right?
Like,
or God, I mean, God, it's just first cause, prime mover,
yeah,
that kind of shit. Eschaton, I guess. I don't know. Not eschaton,
yeah.
Demiurge, I guess, is what I was thinking of.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, the Thales and Heraclitus and, it's water, it's fire, or even with, I believe it's Anaximander that it's a Pyrrhon, right? Which is just the unlimited.
Yeah. Well, Epicurus, well, maybe it's different spelling.
No, it's the same spelling, a Pyrrhon. And so what's nice about them, even though we are still kind of in a sort of idealism, in a sort of, I don't even know that's a good word for it. We're still not in a materialism proper, but there is this move. What's good about the physiologists is that we've moved from explanation by means of religion or myth, which myth has this kind of role of explaining why things are the way they are with these interesting, creative kind of belief systems, and there's always an explanatory kernel in them. This is a move from that type of discourse to a sort of properly scientific, in the broadest sense, type of explanation.
Right.
Where now we're not resorting to myth. We are actually trying to investigate the causes of things without this, we could say, like, superstitious superstructure, right? There is a means to explain things in general and things as a whole with a kind of rationalism, with a kind of reason that isn't founded in anything else but these like base principles. This is kind of thought of as like, the sort of Greek miracle, it's called sometimes, put that in big scare quotes, right? This birth of Western philosophy. And Epicurus is, well, we can go into a lot of it, but I find Epicurus interesting because he's writing in the wake of Plato and Aristotle's deaths, right? I mean, Plato and Aristotle being sort of this change from the sort of the physiologist, the physiological, the sort of all-encompassing interpretation of nature by a primordial principle, an element, to this kind of moral philosophy, but also this kind of rationalism and the archetypes, etc. So Epicurus is indicative of this kind of interesting shift, I think, in philosophy, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today with Marx's dissertation.
It's interesting, I think, to look at this in terms of, I guess, the way that at this time, not Marx's time per se, more so Epicurus's time, would be like the natural sciences and philosophy are still sort of, if not the same discourse, they haven't fully divested from one another entirely, right? Like perhaps the scientific discourse is beginning to bud on the body of philosophy.
I think that
before it diverges at some point. I don't know what that distinction would be, but I just think that's kind of interesting in the context of this myth of the given type thing, and the way that the project of philosophy itself has been maintained over by countless individuals over time. I mean, that's a very incredible phenomenon of itself, right? This discourse is something that spans untold people's timescales, etc., right? Which I think is actually kind of interesting in the sense of the way that they discuss time towards the end, or Marx discusses time relative to this towards the end of the dissertation. But I don't want to get necessarily into that. But
it's an important point, and it's good to think about the sort of.
I mean, that even goes back to Brasier, what he talked about as far as like the sort of diachronic, synchronic movement of philosophy, right? Change within philosophy is a slow moving product. You know what I mean?
Deleuze and Guattari saying, what is philosophy? That human history and the history of philosophy don't have the same rhythm. They're sort of out of sync. It's hard to say whether one is anticipating the other or if they just have a totally different scale, as you're saying. And I do think it's interesting that, with Plato, philosophy does take on, it becomes more of a proper noun, this love of wisdom, with Socrates always sort of loving wisdom, but not necessarily having it, right? It's always this kind of approach or this kind of desire,
like a becoming knowledge. I don't know.
Yeah, or becoming wise. Yeah, that's kind of, with Aristotle, though, you kind of see a different tendency where Aristotle still represents one of these great encyclopedic minds, really trying to collect and aggregate and organize all the fields of knowledge available at the time. So you do see kind of two competing tendencies in a certain sense. With
like a rationality, a scientism,
empiricism.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. I'm glad you reminded me of empiricism, because I think that's a big buzzword for this discussion too.
So with Democritus, we have a type of empirical mindset, and this is kind of how Marx begins to differentiate them. If Democritus and Leucippus, who isn't a part of this, but they're basically thought of as having very similar views. If Leucippus spawned atomism and Democritus kind of is most popularly associated with the conception of atomism, right? With atoms falling in the void, etc. The sort of everything in all matter, all physical nature itself is composed of these indivisible atoms that we can't see, right? Because our senses are not on that magnitude, they're not on that scale. But if he's associated with the birth of it, Epicurus is also known for being an atomism, but as Marx tries to say, it's not so simple, right? There is this difference in this philosophy of nature, right? This philosophy of atomistic physis. And I think that one of the first things that comes clear is how Democritus is a man of science. He is a man of knowledge. He knows geometry. Even if the works haven't survived, is known to have written widely on many different scientific subjects. He sort of travels the world trying to accumulate knowledge from the Egyptians and the Indian gymnosophists and blah, blah, blah. Like that's
Democritus, right? That's not Epicurus.
Yeah, Democritus. Yeah, Democritus is the one who's searching he has this thirst for knowledge. And what I think is interesting about Epicurus, besides visiting some friends in Asia Minor, for the most part, he is sedentary, right? He's not well-traveled.
Tends to his garden.
He tends to his garden. He has a small group of friends. He, in fact, after trying to teach in Athens, is driven out of the city, only to come back like a decade later and then starts to sort of lecture in private circles, these circles of friends, rather than founding a school like Plato or Aristotle, or teaching openly like Democritus. And there are reasons for this, which we can come back to, but it's just interesting to think that, Epicurus is only concerned in knowledge insofar as it can dispel our superstitions and our fears, which cause us to act in a way as to not accord with what we more generally think of as an ethics or a sort of a moral principle, a moral compass. And so for Epicurus, if philosophy is merely about accumulating knowledge, or if even science itself is just about accumulating knowledge, then in fact it's pointless. It should be, its first primary goal should be to help us lead good lives and to help us to attain happiness. That's completely different from Democritus. So that's like a first little like snapshot of the man of science versus the myth breaker, if you will, like the man of living within having enough knowledge of nature so as not to be afraid of death, not to be afraid of the gods who are not concerned with us. They have their own happiness. They're completely happy with and self-contented. They're not bothering us, right? They're not going to punish us. Epicurus is definitely, we would call it loosely like a practical ethics, but it's kind of based on a theoretical physics in a certain way. It's interesting in that sense.
Is it like a archaic version of like Deleuze's transcendental? It's a type of empiricism that he's doing, right? Kind of. Not perhaps, I don't know. Empiricism in a gestational form, I suppose.
Yeah, because for Democritus, in a certain sense, and we talked about this before the show, Democritus is very skeptical about our sense impressions. He thinks of them in such a way that appearance is faulty, and we need this kind of rationalist science to help us to acquire knowledge. Whereas for Epicurus, our sense impressions are what we have and what we have to start with, and they are what we have to trust. So there is this interesting distrust in sensuality and this kind of privileging of a proto-rationalism on Democritus' side, Epicurus fully trusting in the senses and wanting to develop not only a sort of an ethics, but also kind of like a moral psychology of pleasure and pain and happiness based on our sense impressions.
A type of very ancient, or not ancient, but archaic psychoanalysis almost.
There is a sense in which there are certain things in Epicurus's extant little aphorisms and maxims that sound like psychoanalysis. When he says, before we try to act to fulfill a desire, we should ask ourselves what will happen if I achieve this desire, and what will happen if I don't. And I think this comes down to also what I was telling you a little bit before, where Epicurus distinguishes three types of desires: the natural and the necessary, which is food, drink, shelter, warmth. That's the natural and the necessary. If we can kind of circumscribe our desires mostly to that sphere, we'll be pretty happy in general. But then there's the natural and the unnecessary, which is basically sexual desire, which, is not something we can live without, even if it may be kind of a part of our instinctual life. And then there's the unnatural and the unnecessary, which boils down for the most part for him to the accumulation of wealth and the accumulation of power and the accumulation of fame, which is kind of associated. But, for Epicurus, these are neither natural nor necessary. And when our desires really start to dip into that sphere or privilege it, when those become dominant, that's when we live a life full of not only confusion, but of basically, he calls it's completely against the state of ataraxia that he tries to reach. And ataraxia for him is this kind of state of calmness, freedom from mental disturbance, but also kind of physical.
Yeah, it's like vibes. It's like vibing.
Yeah, and Nietzsche sees in this too that one of the merits of Epicurus is kind of moral, practical philosophy, which is that, there are two types of pleasures. One is the kinetic pleasure from motion, which again, sexual desire being one of the key ingredients of that. But the other, there is this kind of static pleasure, which we can't always fulfill because we do have to sort of, fulfill, we have to sort of put our bodies in motion to eat and to drink and whatnot. But for the most part, there is connected with those simple bodily pleasures a state of mind of equanimity, or what he calls ataraxia, this kind of stillness that we can achieve with sort of mental clarity, which is free from fear and free from the superstition of death and the afterlife being full of misery and punishment and all these things that Epicurus thinks are the primary cause of the biggest pains and the biggest distress and the biggest anxieties in life.
And the Christians, of course, take issue with Epicurus and sort of quash the cult of Epicurus. The cult of Epicurus, you call it the Epicureans, because he was a very charismatic and sort of influential guy. Even if he didn't start a school himself, there were many followers of his during and after his life. His little, call it a cult, his little gathering
extends 3 centuries before Christ's birth and 3 centuries after it. So it did take more or less for Rome under, was it Justinian? I'll have to check, to adopt Christianity as the state religion of Rome right before its downfall.
Constantinople, or Constantine, rather.
Yeah, Constantine. Thank you. It was only until Rome adopted it as the official state religion that you see the downfall of the Epicureans, or at least the dissolution of them. And the Epicureans actually show up in Acts, right? I think even Marx quotes it, or he maybe not quotes it, but he has a footnote on it where Paul is kind of trying to convince the Epicureans about this discourse that wouldn't be kind of textual hermeneutics on the traditional Judaic side, and wouldn't be sort of the rational argumentative discourse of the Greeks, but would be this other discourse, this discourse of faith, which obviously wouldn't go by argument or textual exposition. And this is something that they kind of want to hear more about because it's obviously intriguing and it's this new type of discourse. Anyway.
Just briefly, while I'm thinking about this, one of the inspirations for this topic, Marx's dissertation, is that we'll be speaking with Thomas Nail next week. And one of the books that he's written is Marx in Motion. And so, you mentioned motion earlier. So I just wanted to throw that out there. That's sort of the genesis of why we're having this conversation, and in the hopes that this will sort of enrich our ability to dig into that text. And so just to keep that in mind for those that are kind of following along with the episodes and engaging with these thinkers, that this is kind of our reasoning behind taking a look at the dissertation. In addition to I just had some interest in Epicurus. I feel like in high school I had taken one of these, it was almost like the political compass test or something like that. And I get Epicurean.
Okay.
At one point. And so I was always kind of had a appreciation of that, I guess, or like that always kind of stuck with me. And I feel like even Epicurus kind of has a little bit of almost kind of a sterner vibe in some senses.
Yeah.
But maybe not always, but in some cases kind of a reverse, but I don't know. It's kind of interesting.
I think that it's interesting that you got the sort of Epicurean personality. It is this thing where, Epicurus is not providing a philosophy for the state. That is more related to the Platonists and specifically the Stoics. The Stoics are kind of famous for this theory of the cosmos within which we have to become synchronized. So it is this cosmopolitan type of philosophy that was very intriguing to some of the emperors that were founding empires in Alexander's wake. And so they I don't want to say the Stoics ingratiated themselves as much as the emperors enticed them and gave them stipends and kind of endorsed their type of philosophy, because it is this philosophy of a kind of world order.
Are the Stoics also doing any type of physics, or they're sort of after this kind of type of discussion?
No, they are in a certain and they're very much in opposition to Epicurus, which is interesting to me because in the opening foreword and in the epigraph of Marx's dissertation, Marx is like, okay, here's my little dissertation on the difference between Democritus and Epicurus. At a later date, I'm going to talk about the Cynics and the Stoics and the Epicureans and sort of work out more broadly their differences. And then in the epigraph, he's like, oh, due to philosophical and political interests, that's no longer going to happen. Like, he basically kind of admits, like, yeah, I've moved on to bigger and better things. In a certain sense, the difference between the Stoics and the Epicureans are even greater, or at least more apparent than the differences between Democritus and Epicurus. But the Stoics did conceive of a kind of, the easiest way to put it, and this is kind of how Simondon puts it, among other things, but just in terms of their physical theories, which is what you asked about, the Stoics conceive the individual for the Stoics is the cosmos, right? Is the
monad.
Well, I don't know if it would itself be a monad in Leibniz's sense, but the cosmos is sort of world totality and the world soul, the seminal fire from which all things originate.
So that's not a Spinozist type of a point, or
In
am
a
I just
certain-
fucking
in-
them
in-
up? Am I just fucking things up?
in the modern discourse, in the early modern discourse, the difference between Stoics and Epicureans on the basis of substance or on the basis of the individual, you could have Spinoza and Leibniz. Because Spinoza would be like the Stoics, where substance, God, or nature would be cosmos. Would, in a certain sense, the individual is God or nature,
Right.
and everything else is, is sort of a constituent.
Yeah, everything is a mode of expression of the one
Right.
substance or whatever. All
Right,
those
and
different three little things
so-
that Spinoza
so-
describes.
The individual is on the highest magnitude. It's what Lucretius calls the sum of all sums. For Lucretius and the Epicureans, the individual is the atom. That's as
The
far
singularity,
right. That's as far as
the
we can
creative
go.
nothing. So that's kind of the sterner kind of jive I was kind of trying, or maybe I'm just smashing two things against one another.
Well, if the void were somehow thought of as creative, then we could say that, because for Epicurus, all you have is the void and atoms. That's what you have on the sort of basic level.
Right.
So what Simondon tries to do, not only in opposing the Stoics and the Epicureans, but in opposing Spinoza and Leibniz, is that on one end, the individual is too large. Obviously, it's too great. On the other hand, it's too small. And there is an intermediate order of magnitude that we have to situate the individual. And specifically, it's within unique systems of information. But we're not talking about that today. I just think it's interesting to put these things in context.
Oh yeah. The reason I even brought up or asked if the Stoics were involved within physics was just to like kind of make the point towards, I guess, the despot trying to capture the technical machine or the scientific machine.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And the despot trying to found
in the way that you were kind of like the way
Yeah.
that the kings or those trying to found empires were trying to curry favor with Stoics as a sort of way of capturing this, that machine, I suppose.
And as I mentioned earlier, Epicurus is driven out of Athens by a tyrant for teaching in public. So this is why he teaches privately to the society of friends that he gathers, which include women and slaves, whereas the Stoic is kind of teaching this philosophy of the cosmopolitan man that can move from state to state and sort of become syntonic, become attuned with the order within he finds himself. So I think that's why the Stoics are very much a kind of state philosophy, if for accidental reasons or incidental reasons, whereas the Epicureans are much more a kind of semi-nomadic band. And, I think that another thing that's interesting here is you're asking about the physics of the Stoics and the Epicureans. For the physics of Stoicism, what's interesting is the cosmos is the seminal fire, is this igneous fire, this creative fire from which all things emanate. And so in that sense, it's kind of a creative nothing, except it's a creative all. And so the energy that the energy that entities within the cosmic individual, all that energy comes from the cosmos. Whereas if you see in this discussion that Marx walks through very methodically, with Epicurus, you have the atoms in the void, and the void is kind of this indifferent milieu. It's not giving energy to the atoms. The atoms themselves have their own declination due to their own weight. And the swerve, the clinamen that causes them not to fall merely parallel, but to begin just minutely, infinitesimally to swerve off course in this straight line fall, is what causes them to interact and redound and rebound off one another and form these composites. So the swerve is not a part of the void. The swerve is actually inherent to the atoms. So that's a big difference in the physics, that the cosmos is giving energy to as a milieu. It is this energized dynamic milieu. Whereas in the void with Epicureans, it's not. The swerve is self-inherent to the atoms. They have their own inherent kind of kinetic potential.
Again, just to flag that this is kind of, I think, where, we're going to build off of this and looking at Nail's book on Marx and motion. In that book, at least in the introduction, he's talking a bit about the early Marx, Epicurus, etc.
It's interesting to think about what is the animating principle for these two big philosophies at the time, these two Hellenic philosophies that were kind of competing and opposed in so many ways. And it is this notion that the atom, which we said is like the Leibnizian monad, has its own dynamism, its own, Simondon calls the swerve a kind of sort of minimal control energy, right? That is added to the sort of potentially infinite potential energy of the fall, of the free fall. So it's kind of interesting to think about the different dynamics of the two systems.
It's interesting whenever you start getting further into the physics, and when they're talking about points and so forth, and like time and points relative to that, because of, I guess, just considering this in terms of like a sort of motion that has to involve a time, right? Because I think outside of time, nothing is moving. It's only within time, which is like, what did he call it? Like it's an embodied being or something? That's not what he says, but
time becomes sort of
time as abstract form of sensation. Human sensuousness is therefore embodied time, the existing reflection of the sensuous world in itself. That's the quote.
Yeah. And it's also, what's interesting too is that time is the active form of concrete nature, while space is its passive form. Because as we were just saying, the void is this passive medium, this passive milieu. And one of the interesting things that we can extrapolate from this too is the fact that in a certain way, Epicurus, and this is kind of hotly debated in like, Hellenic studies, Epicurus is trying to derive or to base, it's either trying to derive free will or indeterminism from the swerve, from the clinamen, or use the fact of free will and indeterminism as the necessity of the clinamen, of the swerve. Because if the swerve is not a part of the void but inherent to the atom, that is to a certain extent this first glimpse and principle of the reality of indeterminism, right? As against a kind of necessity. Because what the Stoics,
So this is almost getting towards the quantum, right? Quantum indeterminacy.
Heisenberg uncertainty principle, things like this. I mean, that it really was
quantum entanglement as well.
Yeah, it really wasn't until Heisenberg's certainty principle that, because for a long time, the clinamen and the conjoined interest in indeterminism or free will, for a long time, the clinamen was laughed at. Not only by Cicero, he was one of the first to really scathingly remark.
Yeah, Cicero was a hater.
And Plutarch, but for centuries, it was kind of looked down upon. And so it's with Heisenberg's, 27, the certainty principle, that we can't establish the sort of speed and trajectory of or speed and velocity and location, right, of an electron.
Yeah, we can only measure one at a time.
Yeah. So there is something similar to this, at least extrapolating analogically.
I guess the declination, the swerving, is like the motion of the sine wave, of the particle wave itself. Right. And it's interesting too, because light travels as a wave and as a particle.
You're talking about photons, right?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Photons in particular kind of sort of link, right? Because it's either the photon is a particle or it's a wave. It's not both, although I guess with the double slit, you can observe the effects or something.
Well, it is both particle and wave. It's merely about our
being able to perceive
our
logic of sense.
Yeah, there's actually this beautiful line. Now you made me think of it. There's this wonderful line in Lucretius where he talks about sunlight coming through a barn, and we open the door and we adjust our eyes, right? And in the flickering through like the little kind of slit, we see this cloud of dust, almost like this Brownian motion. And we see the sort of randomness, the chance encounters of the dust particles bouncing off each other and forming these little tiny aggregates and composites. And he kind of uses this as a very beautiful, metaphorical, but beautiful illustration of the reality of the clinamen. Right? We can kind of literally see it on a larger scale, obviously attuned to our senses, of these dust particles that and their little motion. And their, I always think about that when I try to think about this in a way that isn't merely abstract, right? I think here too we can see that, with another big difference between the Stoics and Epicurus, and also between Democritus and Epicurus, is the fact that the Stoics, with cosmos and this world order and empire like philosophy, they are thinking about necessity, about fate as this order with which we have to become attuned, right? In order to, we have to sort of
hard determinism.
Yeah, there is a sense in which this is why Cicero attacks Epicurus, because he has much more of a Stoic leaning. He's got a bias. And he even talks about, he uses this beautiful phrase about fate as destiny, as the uncoiling of a capstan when sailors set out to sea, right? Like everything is already contained in the coil, all the different accidents, it was already there. And it's only when it unfolds, when our lives unfold, that we can see all the sort of inherent necessary eventualities. Now, for Epicurus, this is something that he fights against very, very much so. He says one of his most famous lines is, "Better to believe in the legends of the gods than to be slave to the fate of the natural philosophers." He's talking about the Stoics particularly, but Democritus too, to a certain extent, because Democritus isn't the one who introduces this interest in free will or in determinism. I think that that's what's kind of, again, interesting to see in making the clinamen not something outside that happens to the atoms, but something inherent to the atom.
Right. Yeah. Something immanent to its own being.
You could also say, though, that this is also due to the status of ancient physics, that for all of its creativity, for all of its advancements that Epicurus puts forward, even in the face of such doubt, the one thing that is lacking in the notion of atoms and void is field of forces, like gravitational. Like
right.
We understand gravity to be to have to do with weight,
attraction between falling bodies,
right?
But really, I guess it gets relative with, that's an interesting question, I guess, in terms of space, right? Because Einstein, that says what mass does is warp the fabric of space-time itself. So weight, in a sense, like in a very loose sense, weight in terms of mass, weight and mass are not exactly the same thing, I guess. But
no, they're not. That's exactly right. So to a certain extent,
mass, yeah, because size and weight have, I think, a correlation, whereas mass and size don't necessarily have a correlation in terms of linear, like graphing it linearly.
Yeah.
Because like a black hole, for instance, is immense, but it takes up the singularity is like immense, but it's infinitely
dense.
It's infinitely dense is the better way to articulate that.
But it is interesting that Epicurus is able to predict what, with like Galileo, sort of bodies falling in a void are more or less falling at equal speeds. There's pros and cons, obviously, but for the most part, there's a lot of interesting physical predictions, one could say, with Epicurus. And it's just that the theory of force fields is a much more modern attainment. Anyway, this is all to kind of generally sketch the status of Epicurean philosophy in broad strokes, as opposed to its milieu and what it's reacting to. Because in a certain sense, it is reacting to,
Platonism.
to Platonism and Aristotelianism,
Democritus.
but definitely also Stoicism and Democritus. And Epicurus is not merely adopting wholesale Democritus, either his theoretical perspective on knowledge and knowledge accumulation as being a sort of end in itself, and this notion of free will and determinism. In fact, there was something I just wanted to say before we move on, where I mentioned this earlier, but I just want to make sure we get it. Epicurus says, "Vain is the word of a philosopher by whom no human suffering is cured. For just as medicine is of no use if it fails to banish the diseases of the body, so philosophy is of no use if it fails to banish the suffering of the mind." And I think that that's where another difference from Democritus, and it's found in his kind of moral teaching and Epicurus's moral teaching, where it's like, look, knowledge accumulation is no good if it doesn't help us lead healthier lives.
Right. Whereas capitalism will hijack this, right? Capitalism hijacks the scientific and technical machines, and then it takes away our ability it displaces pleasure that Epicurus is talking about, and puts it in this sort of Democritean way of it's like a Manichaean, right? Like a Manichaean type worldview. It's like the hard determinism, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're right to talk about capitalism sort of creating these new. We talked about it last week as these flows of bullshit.
I mean, hold me tight and spit on me, right? That's different than, that's opposed to Epicurus, and because that doesn't really, you know what I mean? Like, it's like displacing desire from pleasure, I guess, or from physical pleasure, or I don't know.
It's increasing. What he would say is it's increasing our desires, the unnatural and unnecessary desires, and making them seem as though they are.
Yeah, it's creating lack everywhere,
needs.
Right? It's creating lack everywhere. Yeah, like they say in Anti-Oedipus, a manufactured lack, a produced lack.
It's more void for your dollar. Yeah,
nice.
There's also this great image that, just to speak about, because we said earlier, and Marx works through this, that there's an infinite number of atoms, there's an infinite amount of void. A pyrrhon actually means less infinite, but unlimited. But it's interesting that Lucretius tries to demonstrate this with a very interesting analogy. He's like, okay, let's say the universe were limited and we stood at the edge of the universe and threw a spear, sort of trying to throw it outside of the universe. Either it would be stopped and repelled, which means there would be matter there that would stop it,
right?
Or it would sort of pass through this limit and show that there's space there. So it's this kind of interesting, crude but interesting visualization.
Right. Yeah, that's almost goes to that kind of hard limit and relative limit type dialectic.
Mm-hmm.
I think this next passage is one that's ripe for us to discuss, because this gets a little bit into time. Composition is the merely passive form of concrete nature, time its active form. If I consider composition in terms of its being, then the atoms exist beyond it, in the void, in the imagination. If I consider the atom in terms of its concept, then composition either does not exist at all or exists only in the subjective imagination. For composition is a relationship in which the atoms, independent, self-enclosed, as it were uninterested in one another, have likewise no relationship to one another. Time, in contrast, the change of the finite to the extent that change is posited as change, is just as much the real form which separates appearance from essence and posits it as appearance while leading it back to essence. Composition expresses merely the materiality of the atoms as well as the nature emerging from them. Time, in contrast, is in the world of appearance what the concept of the atom is in the world of essence, namely the abstraction, destruction, and reduction of all determined being into being for itself. Now that is a banger.
Yeah, if all we have are atoms and the void, the reason for this is that, as we have kind of said, atom itself kind of means that which cannot be cut, but it's what's indivisible. And there are an infinite number of atoms, infinite amount of void, but they also don't come into being or pass away. This is kind of the interesting thing. they are not subject to dissolution itself. What is subject to dissolution is the composites formed by the aggregation of matter and
Their properties
by
that
the
emerge,
aggregation of atoms. Yes.
and the properties that emerge from that aggregation. Correct.
Yes. Yeah, and the images they give off, right?
Which
There's
is really
this-
interesting, right?
yeah.
Because, like, in a sense, yes, even if you're going physics, I mean, this is not exactly the same thing because it applies more to energy, but what is it, the
conservation of matter.
law of conservation of energy would say energy is neither created nor destroyed. And if all matter is energy slowed down to a vibration, then that would be true.
Yes. So Epicurus is one of the things to note that, atoms themselves are not subject to, in themselves are not subject to change, but they can enter into combinations in the sort of minimal swerve.
Yeah, that's I didn't even appreciate in my reading how much of a mind fuck that concept is.
Mm-hmm.
But it's that's quite a mind fuck to wrap your head around.
That line you read, for composition is a relationship in which the atoms, independent, self-enclosed, as it were, uninterested in one another, have likewise no relationship to one another. But then time, you introduce time into that, and then this is where we get to the real form. This is where we get to sort of concrete interaction. And this sort of opens them up to have these interactions in a certain sense and to form composites. But the composites themselves are subject to becoming, are subject
the assemblages,
to dissolution.
The kind of molecular assemblages of atoms are subject to difference.
Yeah,
not the atoms themselves.
Right. And that's sort of an interesting thing, which is why this is one of them.
But then atoms themselves are alienated from their concept, right? Like I start to lose.
Well, that's insofar as they have qualities, I think, right? And that's insofar as the infinity of atoms implies not necessarily an infinity of unique atoms, but at least a sort of indefinite number of different atoms, which would have different. It's not that there are two different types of atoms. It's that there are different determinations of one and the same form of atom.
Ooh,
right? This is part of what
good.
Marx is doing. Because he is kind of working through some of this stuff he is getting from Hegel's reading of Epicurus, which we left out because it just get a little bit too bogged down. And we're trying to do a Hegel light version. but yeah, insofar as the atom is abstract individuality for Marx, at the same time and contradictorily, not necessarily in a bad sense, because for Marx, what's interesting about Epicurus is that he tarries with the contradictions and wants to think through them and not just to wave them away.
Yeah.
The fact that atoms are abstract and individuality, and yet at the same time cannot be said to not have certain qualities, right? As we know from like our modern Mendeleev elementary table, right? We know that there are different atoms and they have
atomic weight, right?
Yeah, I mean, that are differentiated on their atomic weight.
Atomic weight, atomic mass, I guess, are actually two different things, right? It's interesting though too, but what's cool, kind of interesting, is that there are, I guess, in terms of the composition or the properties of the atoms, right? Some atoms are heavier, right?
Yeah,
like the mass is a thing,
like Epicurus predicted.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, if you look at the way that a star forms or the earth, or like, I mean, this is literally how elements are formed within the heart of a star, right? It's like the heaviest elements are like lead, and that's what is at the base of the star. Iron, like all of the heavier elements are it's a gradient from the center of the star or the planet, right? The earth falls in this too, right? It's a molten iron core within the heart of the earth, and a gradient from dense to light, right? The crust is the lighter material, like silica, etc. Carbon, right? These are lighter elements than something like lead, iron, etc. Or uranium, right? Like that kind of shit that's like super packed with stuff, with energy, I suppose, with the kinetics that he gets into, which is another interesting little diversion, but I won't go down that.
It's good. It's but it is this interesting notion that while the atoms are sort of indifferent to one another, they still maintain through their own self-contained swerve and through the consequential incidence of atoms upon one another, like we said, with the dust particles aggregating, they form these compositions. And in that sense, it's the compositions that are mortal, so to speak, and that come to be and pass away, not the atoms themselves.
Right. That's so weird, right? Like that's such a bizarre.
But what's interesting is Lucretius uses this as an example of why we shouldn't fear death, because he says
the atoms are eternal. Yeah.
When we die, we're almost what he considers the unity of, say, like a human individual, and he wouldn't use that word, a human being. The unity of the human being is sort of the different relations between the different atoms.
Aggregates of atoms, yeah.
And when we die, the first atoms to leave the body and to break up this unity, because he conceives the unity of the human being as like an airtight seal. When we die, that airtight seal is ruptured, and the lightest elements leave first, and the lightest are the soul, which is why we can't be there to experience death. He says we can but die, we cannot be dead, which is again, so the first little atoms to leave, they're the lightest, are the soul, and they leave upon the disaggregation, the breaking down of the unity of the body.
Yeah, that's interesting in terms of the practicality of like a star whenever it off gases. So the lighter elements are off gassed first. So the star starts to shed its lighter layers, like helium and shit like that, right? Is way lighter, for instance, than, like I was using the example of lead, etc. But anyways, that was just sort of to draw the fractal sort of nature of all this stuff, or seemingly at least the appearance, the sense appearance, if you will.
Yeah.
Combined with some type of irrationalism.
Right. Yes, because the fact that we can't see the atoms, they are imperceptible. It's not necessarily due to a failure of our senses. It's the fact that our senses are not on the same scale. If we were little tiny homunculi on the scale of atoms, we'd be able to see them. And This is what leads them to be sort of irrational. We can perceive them sort of with the mind, but not with the eye.
And then we can perceive their effects, but we can't actually see them. Our electron microscope, I'd have to look this up actually, now that I brought this.
Well, this is where the word atom is not so helpful, because we know that the atom, at least in modern science, is divisible and it has smaller parts.
Okay, so they're impossible to view through a light microscope.
Yes, but not through an electron microscope.
Right.
And so, this is kind of why Leibniz is, even if there are other difficulties with his theory, this is why Leibniz's word monad is interesting. And his conception of monads is better for science because it's monads all the way down.
Right. Yeah.
There's already this theoretical discussion of quarks having these kind of sub-quark elements. And so it is kind of monads all the way down, even if
fractal all the way down as well, right? That would be the same thing. Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's literally what it is if it's literal monads all the way down and up, which is also interesting, I guess, getting into the actual like modern day physics, right? Because as I was kind of rehearsing in the pregame that, I've heard this example given that an atom, let's say if you scale it up to the size of like a football stadium, let's say a large high school football stadium, the nucleus of the atom would be like a pinhead on the 50-yard line. And the sort of parking lot of the stadium would be like the orbital limit of the atom itself. So that's a tremendous amount of empty space within the constitutive element of all matter itself, which I guess is probably why some people want to, problematize matter itself, the existence of matter, like Graham Harman mentioned. I don't know, in your reading of Harman's work, did you encounter any of that stuff? Because he just barely touched on that in the discussion we had. But I think that was a super interesting point to me.
Yeah, there are strains in speculative realism about sort of a materiality without matter, etc., where matter is still this kind of idealist presupposition. And Harman does go into that a little bit. and he's not alone. Larwell has written on this. It's kind of an interesting avenue. I would say that this, again, your analogy, which I think is really helpful to kind of conceptualize the atom in modern physics, having so much empty space, being mostly empty space, if we consider it, right? That this is antithetical to the Epicurean conception of atoms. Atoms themselves in the Epicurean theory would not have empty space, right? In fact, Marx, as you've kind of highlighted here, has defined the atom is the immediate negation of abstract space, hence the spatial point.
Yeah.
So void would be external to atoms. Again, precisely because in Greek that atom means that which can not be cut, right? It can't be broken down further. So it would have no void.
Right. That draws the distinction between like the atoms, the philosophical conceptual atoms that they're speaking of here versus the atoms of modern physics are not the same thing, even conceptually.
And that's why atom in our parlance is a misnomer, but names stick, right? I mean, they stick, and for want of conceptual reconfiguration and innovation, we're stuck with that. We're stuck with the word.
It sounds better than like corpuscle or whatever.
Yes. In a certain sense, the atoms of the ancient Greek looks more like the corpuscle of outdated theories, because I would assume corpuscles would be much more of full bodies.
True. Right. Yeah.
Full bodies without organs.
Yeah. Exactly.
To misuse, to do another misuse. So that's kind of interesting to think about, that we're sort of stuck with this terminology and no one really questions it. But I think that, instead of saying like, oh, well, it's not true to the Epicurean theory, I think it would be like, what's good about the word atom as it's used, and there's an Amber Alert. Sorry about that. What's good about the term atom, even if it's not true to the Greek, it still shows its inheritance from these Greek philosophies that we're discussing. Right. So in that sense, it does a kind of homage.
Yeah.
And has a good intention, where even if it's etymologically incorrect,
Yeah, because it goes back to show the continuity between philosophy and the physical and natural sciences having been a unified discipline at one point, basically, that I mentioned earlier.
This inheritance of the history of ideas and antiquity, and
and it goes to the myth of the given, right? It's like it's by mistake, it's by missing the true or whatever that we fail forward, right?
Well, now you sound very Hegelian.
I know I'm sorry. I'm becoming more Hegelian as
the identity of difference and non-difference and blah blah blah. So gosh, what's some other interesting things? Just to circle back to some of the interesting things that Marx discusses in describing the difference in like character between Democritus and Epicurus, which I think is interesting and may again shed some light, because in a certain sense, Marx is trying to pull a kind of put these two thinkers in opposition, not just in terms of their physics, but even in terms of what we said in terms of their moral theories, which we talked about a little bit, but also in terms of their temperament. And we talked about how they both kind of faced death. And Democritus is, and again, this could be apocryphal, this could be anecdotal, but is supposed to have blinded himself because, as we kind of said, he as a man of science grew wary, grew almost obsessively skeptical of the senses, right? Cicero even relates like Democritus sees the sun and knows that it's of such great size because of its distance from us, because he knows geometry, whereas Epicurus is fine to say that the sun, it appears 2 feet large, so it is 2 feet large, right? Because again, our sense impressions are that which has to be our guide. And instead, you described this very eloquently, and I want you to kind of maybe reproduce it. How does Epicurus, when he's on the verge of death, what does he go and do?
When he's ready to die, he takes a nice bath, and like, I think he invites his friends over to talk.
That's right.
No, he tells his friends to continue enjoying like philosophy or something, basically.
Right, because for Epicurus, philosophy is the basis for happiness. It is the basis for living a healthy life. That's his kind of key central tenet. it's not about this sort of unlimited thirst for knowledge. And this is why when he says like a philosophy that doesn't help us lead a healthier life, and he sounds very Nietzschean here too, because in many ways, the gay science is about a science of convalescence, about a science of perspectives in the continuum between illness and becoming healthier, and sort of the perspective shift that we have back on health when we are ill and back on illness when we are health. And that is a kind of that overcoming, that self-overcoming too of illness. That overcoming of resistance is this feeling of power and therefore this feeling of joy. And there is a sense in which Epicurus is emblematic of this type of self-overcoming. But it's a self-overcoming by restricting our sphere of sort of unnecessary and harmful desires. And therefore, this is why philosophy, go on doing philosophy, which means go on, living within a certain confine where even little is not only enough, but feels like wealth and is healthy, right? It's ataraxia again, right? It's this free from disturbance.
Yeah, it was kind of funny. Didn't mention this earlier, but we were talking about how I had taken that personality test and like relative to me being an Epicurean. I think it is kind of funny like that. I think one of the primary things in my life that gives me joy is to talk philosophy on the podcast with my friends. So
yeah. The two principal sources of wealth for Epicurus are wisdom and friendship. And, I think that that's something we try to, since we're getting meta, since we're going to be meta today. That's two of the things that we do try to, espouse and work through in the show.
Union of egoists is kind of this thing too. Via Stirner, the union of egoists is like, it's a group of friends, basically. The recognition of the joy of one another's like intercourse with one another, not sexual, but dialogue, but as intercourse, not discourse.
Yeah.
Which I think there's a distinction there. There's a connotation of openness. I think there's a reciprocity of intercourse and egalitarianism that's not connoted by discourse, right? Discourse is like typically, I don't know, it's like it can be despotic, right? Or like it's hierarchical, whereas intercourse is horizontal. It's the rhizome. But anyways, I'll shut up.
Thinking about this notion of Epicurus and again, basically this notion of free will or indeterminism that he is fond of. And he's basically trying to articulate the fact that, we are able to sort of attain a kind of freedom through ataraxia, through sort of freedom from, it's a freedom from mental disturbance and a freedom from confusion, a freedom from fear, a freedom from superstition. And that is, I think, important for him. And that's why he defines philosophy in this way about sort of, a sort of becoming healthier, because it is ridding of us of all these things that would bind us to a type of necessity, right? Into these desires that are unnatural. And
to go back to our friend Elliot, it's like a rational, self-interest, right?
Yeah, rational self-interest.
An example of a type of rational self-interest in Epicurus.
Yeah, I mean, for him, it's a self-interest, but it's not. I don't know. I guess that's the question would be where the line then would be drawn between it being unconscious desires and conscious self-interest. Because for a certain extent,
true, right?
Epicurus is trying to tell us to become self-conscious. And in fact, Marx's interest in Epicurus in the dissertation is very much rooted in this privileging of sensuous reality that culminates in this sort of movement of self-consciousness and this becoming self-conscious of our freedom, right? And becoming self-conscious of our desires and their achievement, and in a way that rids them of all of these externalities and all of these things that we find necessary in our culture, right? And this demand to sort of to love and to be loved, and all of this shit that we see way before capitalism. You see it like in Augustine and in these other things, specifically from like a personal God. And this is why I think it's interesting that Epicurus is like, look, no, the gods exist, but they live between worlds. They are so perfect that they have no interest in anything else, and they don't act. It kind of accords with Aristotle's notion of perfection, which is something that is an end in itself, has no need to act, right? And so the gods don't care about us. They're not going to punish us. There is this kind of Nietzschean, proto-Nietzscheanism in Epicurus when he kind of disputes the metaphysics of the hangman that would want to find a self that would be responsible and that would be the cause, the necessary cause for actions. You know, he's trying to get us to see that, you know, we don't have to be miserable. We don't have to fear death, that we don't, and that one of the main things beyond fearing death that keeps us from realizing joy in the everyday is a desire for immortality, and that desire for immortality is
creates a lack.
Yeah, well, it would create a lack, and it would also, he kind of makes this interesting argument that even if we were to live immortally, this would not necessarily increase the sort of joy that we were able to feel, the sort of pleasure we would be able to feel in a limited time frame. That in fact, given infinite time, our joy would not necessarily increase. So,
and this is what I was sort of, I think, trying to get to earlier in the pregame relative to like, wait, say that again. Say what you were.
That the amount of joy felt in a limited life, and even living within our means and living within the boundaries of sort of proper desire, living a healthy life, all of this, in fact, wouldn't be increased.
Yeah. So
with immortality.
And see, this is where what I was trying to say earlier, I think, is that our ephemeral nature, or our ephemeral being, or like time being imminent to being, is what sets what is constitutive of our ability to experience phenomenon, I guess, right? Because the gods don't experience phenomenon because they exist outside of time. They don't need to change because they're already perfect monads or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, Epicurus makes it, he kind of says it a little bit differently, but with a similar outcome, where the gods are physical, but they're just so perfectly composed that it's as though they were, and they live between the worlds, right? They live in the intermundia. They don't participate in our worlds, but they have their own joys, but they're perfectly sort of self-contained, like the atom. They're perfectly indifferent, like the atoms to, they are removed from these relations with the world that I think is like a kind of a theme that Laruelle himself develops in his own way. I'm not calling him Epicurean, about this interest in not being determined by the world, not sort of being forced by it into these relations. Epicurus is wanting us to be able to take on this freedom of sort of curtailing all these relations that modern society and ancient society obviously would sort of get us embroiled in. And he's kind of wanting us to see that the relations within which we enter are, like the swerve, a product of sort of our inherent movement, and that we can become conscious of that, and that we can then disentangle ourselves. And, you know, this is why Epicureanism is not some sort of hedonistic philosophy of getting pleasure. It's actually really much about, like, you're intensifying the pleasure by removing all of these externalities that seem necessary, but are in fact just these relations that are completely
superfluous.
Yeah, superfluous. Exactly.
right, or not germane to like
true
our,
happiness.
our true or our lives, enjoyment, I guess.
And this is why it's completely antithetical to like the Stoic philosophy of there's this world cosmic order that we have to get in line, we have to get attuned to. And it's when we're out of tune that we are sort of trying to fight against fate, and that leads to unhappiness. For Epicurus, it's completely false.
A world given to us versus a world that's made by by our actions,
and that's a fundamental kind of that statement you just made, and you can repeat it. That's a fundamental Marxist articulation.
The world having been made, that, I mean, I had sort of understood that, but like now I think Anti-Oedipus has really helped me kind of get a really good grasp on the way that history moves and like humanity and knowledge move throughout history, etc. I don't know, super interesting.
In the passages we read last week with Gil, they make this point that moving from the despotic machine with its imminent overcoating unity of the despot, right? The sort of phallus removed from the chain as like the unique object, to the body with organs of capital with its differential relations and abstract flows conjoining together, is like moving from Parmenides, the great thinker of the one, to Democritus, right? The thinker of atomism. So capitalism is like the imminent field of the atoms, of the flows, of the quantitative abstract flows, just like the abstract atoms.
Nice.
It's kind of an offhand statement they make, but I've been mulling it over in my head, thinking through, even though it's not Parmenides versus Democritus in this dissertation, it's still interesting to think about the body of the despot to the body of abstract, decoded, deterritorialized differential flows. So that becomes the interesting thing then, too, since we're on Anti-Oedipus, is that, the Democritean body without organs of capital and capital flows, streams of atoms, there's something there that I would have to work out where, Epicurus would be an anathema to the body without capital, right? As in their demeanor, in the introduction of the swerve, because the swerve wouldn't be inherent to the flows, and therefore, the flows are completely determined by the differential relations in which they enter into. They're stripped of all quality, like the concept of the atom is supposed to be abstract individuality. But the flows are endowed with qualities after being determined, right? Dx and dy by themselves are nothing, but they do take on qualities after entering into a relationship. And I think that that's maybe somewhat what Marx is trying to talk about with the concept of the atom as abstract individuality. The notion of atoms having qualities is completely foreign to them, and yet it's a necessary implication that they do have qualities. In a certain sense, he's thinking of the differential relation that Deleuze and Guattari sort of analyze in the body of capital and decoded flows. Maybe
that's a better way of conceiving my idea about how death and being sort of are are they in a differential type of a relation?
Death and being?
Yeah.
In a differential relationship?
I mean, just in terms of the way that, I don't know, I was just thinking, like I said, like death seems like the hard limit to being, right? Like its external limit is death. But without that limit, then it is God, because it lives forever and doesn't change. It doesn't have any sensual perception, right? Like, you know what I mean?
But as we said, atoms don't know death.
Right.
Neither does the unconscious. So if atoms are standing in for abstract being, then I'm not sure if death would be
is there an unconscious? Well, what about in the context of eros? So increasing complexity, right, as a drive for preservation of this body, like the body without organs type, like the superorganism, right?
It would seem that time as concrete nature, as the real form of nature, insofar as Marx describes it in one of the last chapters, the penultimate chapter of the book, time would be the sort of cooperation of Thanatos and Eros, as you're describing, if we're thinking in terms of Freudian death drive.
Right.
That the atoms themselves enter through their imminent swerve, enter into relationships that die. They are meant to die through an imminent principle, even if their death comes from without. It sort of arises from within, as Stills and Guattari are always talking about with the primitive territorial machine and the despotic machine, because to a certain extent, their dissolution is both internal and compositions, not atoms. But the composites, they sort of start to lose their internal cohesive force, right? Which Epicurus he'll try to talk about them in terms of the shape of the atoms, like slipping and so all this stuff, which becomes very kind of, pseudoscientific when you read it today. But the death comes from without, because it is a force greater than the internal cohesive force keeping the atoms together in a composition. It comes to attack their unity, right? And that's what breaks them down. So it is a kind of imminent death, even if it comes from without. It sort of arises, its principle arises from within. And that's kind of how Freud thinks the death drive in terms of organisms, at least.
Right.
So we can apply this to Epicurean composites. I think that there could be some kind of analogy there.
Nice. Okay. So I'm not as full of shit as I thought. The response to death that we talked about relative to Democritus and Epicurus.
Well, their own deaths. Yeah, right.
Their literal approach to the way that they respond to this hard limit of death. It almost feels like Epicurus's drive is to the acquisition of knowledge to conquer death, is sort of which kind of maps onto, I think, the drive of science in our modern discourse, in a sense. This even goes back to symbolic exchange in death as well.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. There's this line that Epicurus has where he says, "We are born only once, and we cannot be born twice, and one must for all eternity exist no more. You are not in control of tomorrow, and yet you delay your opportunity to rejoice. Life is ruined by delay, and each and every one of us dies without enjoying leisure." So that's,
if you think about the hangman, or not the hangman, the bondsman and the slave, I think that kind of has some cachet.
Struggle to the death. The Lord is willing to wager his own death.
And you're in sort of bad faith relative to your own enjoyment.
Right. I mean, that's kind of, and this is why, again, Epicurus sounds like a proto-Nietzsche when he's saying shit like this, because it sounds very much like the eternal return and Nietzsche's kind of ethical demand that, when we are told we will live the same life an infinite number of times, do we despair, do we rejoice? And what the demand is saying is like, and this is Epicurus too, because he's thinking about these moments of pleasure and joy. It's conceive of that moment that would make you rejoice in living it over and over and willing it forever. Mm-hmm. And in willing that moment, you have to will everything that came before. That's just a necessary consequence. Then go out and, fucking carpe diem and all that shit. Make that moment crystallize. Make your life something to which you will not despair and having to redo it over and over, sort of exult. Easier said than done. But that again is kind of this mantra of Epicurus and Nietzsche in his own way with the gay science, conceiving philosophy as this discourse on sort of becoming healthy and therefore becoming able to find joy.
If you see anything on this list or whatever that piques your interest, just let me know. Because I think we kind of talked about some of this already.
Yeah, time is, what does it say? Excluded from the concept of the atom, right? The atom is eternal. It's the atoms in their swerves and their rebounding, their sort of incidents that forms composites that then can enter into becoming, and then that's when we can see time as concrete. Yeah, I mean, we've talked about that, but that it bears repeating. It makes sense.
I thought this was quite interesting, though. Time itself offers proof that not everything need have an origin, a moment of beginning.
This again is this notion that the atoms are eternal, they're infinite, just like the void is eternal and infinite. They don't have a genesis per se, which would give a different meaning to your creative nothing.
Talk about that a little bit.
Because we are not given, because they are presupposed as the principle out of which all genesis and creation occurs, they are not themselves treated as being created. It would be an infinite regress. This is kind of the same way with God, substance, and Spinoza as self-cause, right? Is not alienated in its cause, is immanent in the cause of itself, is kind of an ex nihilo, as out of a nothing. The same with the atoms and the void.
Does it have anything to do with the quasi-cause stuff, or am I just...
I don't think so, because the quasi-cause would be back to this sort of evolution of the connections of production and recording and all these other things. It would kind of get us more into human society. The atoms themselves are not created or destroyed. Matter cannot be created or destroyed. That's still kind of one of our, right? The compositions into which matter can configure itself and become configured. Sure. That's when we can start to think about becoming and death and individuation.
See, it's so interesting to me that there's like all these things seem divided against themselves in the kind of Hegelian fashion. Within the seed of life is death.
It becomes the thing where life and death are only seemingly opposites, though, right? Life does not imply...
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily...
Life does not mean deathlessness, right? It's, Simondon finds a kind of beyond the pleasure principle, a kind of death drive within life himself. He calls it amortization, which kind of says like, insofar as individuals individuate, there are always necessarily installed within those individuations little like packets of death on the installment plan, right? But in a different sense, right? It's like this kind of cancerous thing. It's just and we can look at this from like the standpoint of embryology, like Deleuze and Guattari would do, and all of these things, that the embryo can undergo these individuations that would rip apart the adult biological being that it becomes. As we age, we are able to restructure our individuations less and less. And I think that for Simondon, this is why he comes to the conclusion that the sort of desire for immortality, kind of like with Epicurus, this desire to be an absolute being is inherently unethical. And Lucretius talks about life as being run by runners in a relay race that are handing off this torch down the line. Atoms in their incidence and composition are like just the little seeds that are able to imbue these runners with the fire that lights their torch, and they're handing it off down the generations.
It's interesting to think of Epicurus as this quasi, like a pre-empiricism almost, relative to like the Scottish philosopher. Why am I blinking?
Hume.
Yeah, Hume. I was a big fan of Hume in my intro to philosophy class, by the way.
Well, in a certain sense, Hume's like theory of the bundles of perceptions, that kind of coincides. His attack on determinism is very similar to Epicurus.
I guess that makes sense.
His argument that miracles are merely that for which we do not yet have scientific explanations, but can eventually be explained with enough advancement in science or understanding. That kind of accords with Epicurus saying the gods don't intervene in our world, right? Because one of Epicurus's principles is, insofar as we're interested in natural science, we want to be able to describe what is of popular opinion as super sensual, as being supernatural, as natural. So Yeah, I do think that there are a lot of resonances with Hume.
I didn't have anything else relative to this. I'm looking forward to see how Nail kind of progresses his thesis relative to Marx in motion and what he draws from the dissertation. So hopefully this provides some nice color and background to that. But that's really all I had today.
No, I think that's great. I think it's good. We were able to sort of use Marx as a jumping off point and talk also a little bit about sort of the context within which Epicurus is thinking and why he's interested in these questions, what he's reacting to. So I thought it was really good.
Yeah, I had fun. I suppose that will wrap up this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. Bye, y'all.
Of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.